Howdy y'all, Andy here, and welcome to King's Comics. Now, for those of you who may or may not have heard the news, Into the Spider-Verse has won a Golden Globe for Best Animated Movie. This is big because it beat out all the, or any Studio Ghibli movies, or any Disney or Pixar movies, which is awesome. For those of you who have watched my review, there's a link down below. I absolutely love the movie. It's definitely one of my favorite superhero movies as well as animated movies of all time. That being said, I've read the comments and I've seen a couple people ask me where's the best place to get into Spider-Man. Now, that's kind of hard because after Into the Spider-Verse, people might be a little bit confused because we were introduced to multiple different versions of Spider-Man. That being said, it really depends, once again, on which Spider-Man you want to get into. So, let's go. If you want to get into the original Peter Parker, that's the Earth 616, the mainline continuity Peter Parker, the best place to start is with the Stan Lee and Steve Ditko Spider-Man. That's the, you can find them on Amazon. They're the Essential Spider-Man collections. Those are just the baseline Spider-Man comics. That's Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were the original creative team. If you want to read about the just original Golden Age, Silver Age Peter Parker, those are going to be it. Those are the classics. That's how you get introduced to villains like Doc Ock and Mysterio, Sandman, the original Sinister Six, all these guys. Venom doesn't come on till a lot later. That's the kind of the Todd McFarlane Spider-Man era, but the main point is if you want to get involved with Peter Parker, the original Peter Parker, that's going to be the Essential Spider-Man collections by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Now, what about Peter Parker from the Ultimate Universe? This is called the 1610 or the 1610 universe. This is actually where most of the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is based out of. So that being said, if you want to get started with those, you're going to be looking for the Brian Michael Bendis Ultimate Spider-Mans. Those came around about 2007-ish. Those are where you have Peter Parker. Actually, Peter Parker from the original Spider-Man storylines was around kind of junior, senior year, about to go into college. The kind of Tom Holland Spider-Man, the kind of more teeny Spider-Man you're looking for is from the Ultimate Universe. That's where Peter Parker is around 14 to 16 years old, becoming Spider-Man. So that's the one, that's the younger version of Peter Parker, definitely, without a doubt, going through puberty. And that's by Brian Michael Bendis. Once again, that's a great point to start if you want a Peter Parker more in line with the MCU. Now we get into Miles Morales. Brian Michael Bendis, same guy who wrote and helped create and instantiate the Ultimate Universe Peter Parker, also wrote and helped create alongside artist Sarah Pichelli the Miles Morales Spider-Man. So after Peter Parker, spoiler alert, Peter Parker dies in the Ultimate Universe as well as into the Spider-Verse, Miles Morales takes over for him. So that's Brian Michael Bendis pretty much hands off the torch. So this is around 2012. I mean, you'll kind of see the volume issues, but I say that because several years later, Marvel started to re-release the Miles Morales comics and rewrite them as Miles entered the mainline continuity. But what you're looking for is going to be the Brian Bendis Miles Morales Ultimate Spider-Man comics from around 2012. Now we get into Spider-Gwen. And Spider-Gwen actually has her own comic called Spider-Gwen, which is by Jason Latour, as well as, I believe, Robbie Rodriguez is the artist, the creative team. She has a comic called Spider-Gwen. It's pretty easy to find, but that's where you're going to find her own. She's in her own universe with alternate takes on a lot of different Marvel heroes and villains, as well as even Peter Parker's in there. That being said, you want to go ahead and read those if you want to know more about Spider-Gwen. If you want to know more about different types of Spider-Men, there's a collected trade, a volume of the Spider-Verse Spider-Man. This is called Edge of the Spider-Verse. It's 5 issues in one collection, and it's about different Spider-Men, some of which are seen in the movie, including Spider-Gwen, the Mecha Spider, Penny Parker, as well as Spider-Noir, and then 2 other Spider-Men who were not featured in the movie. That's called, once again, Edge of the Spider-Verse, and it leads into the Spider-Verse Marvel comic event. Now, what about if you want to get into Spider-Noir? That's kind of easy because there's a Spider-Man Noir comic. This was during the kind of age of Marvel trying to create a separate universe and a different branch of the Marvel multiverse where they had this noir universe. You have characters like, I believe, Wolverine, Luke Cage, Daredevil, and Spider-Man who are in that universe with their own noir versions. This is around the 1930s-ish era. Things are in black and white, and it's a pretty gritty kind of a detective-esque narrative. It's really fun, but it might not be for everyone. But if you liked Nicolas Cage's portrayal of Spider-Noir, then I definitely recommend reading Spider-Man Noir. Now, let's kind of advance into, if you've already read this, if you're already familiar with these characters. That gets into these different kind of, offshoot Spider-Man, not just Spider-Gwen or Spider-Man Noir. But what about if you've read the Dan Slott run of Spider-Man, which is pretty recent, before Nick Spencer started writing Spider-Man. He's the current author for Spider-Man. You had this run called the Superior Spider-Man. For those who may or may not be familiar with it, this is where Doc Ock, that's Dr. Octopus, Otto Octavius, in the mainline Spider-Man universe, took over Peter Parker's body and vowed to become a greater Spider-Man than Peter was, if not the best superhero, like the greatest superhero, the Superior Spider-Man. Now, that was, a lot of people, me included, thought it was just going to be trash, thought it was going to just bomb and fail, but it was fantastic. I absolutely loved it. Seeing Otto Octavius, seeing Doc Ock try to become an actual hero rather than just the villain that he's always been was a fun run, as was seeing him have to confront a lot of his personal faults and flaws in terms of just a lot of good character development for a very classic Spider-Man villain. Now, if you like that or you like that idea, then I've got another recommendation for you, and this is going to sound a little crazy, but it's called The Superior Foes of Spider-Man. Now, this takes place concurrently at the same time as Superior Spider-Man, but it's I would call it the best Spider-Man book that is not about Spider-Man. So rather than it being about Spider-Man, it takes place during Doc Ock being Spider-Man, and it's written by Nick Spencer, the guy who is the writer who's writing Spider-Man currently. Now, it's about these just random kind of C or D class Spider-Man villains who are getting together to try and either take on Spider-Man or pull the heist of a lifetime. It's like the Ocean 6 of C or D class superhero villains. It is wonderful. It's funny. I love it. Once again, it's a great companion piece to the Superior Spider-Man without actually having to really do with them. It's just a bunch of Spider-Man villains. I recommend that as well, but only if you're a little bit more well-versed in the, I guess, the Spider-Man continuity or with Peter Parker or everything going on with that. Now, let's kind of ground it and bring it back to a more, if you're into Peter Parker or if you want to get more on the emotional side of things, especially because you've got these two critical relationships in Peter Parker's life, which are Mary Jane as well as Gwen Stacy. If you want to know a lot more about Gwen Stacy, there are two pretty key works I would consider, which are The Night That Gwen Stacy Died, which is when she passes away. This is I think this is actually kind of considered to be the end of the silver, if you will, the silver age of comics, which was a little bit more innocent, but started to do like more edgier storylines, but kind of because it was when a major character for the first time had actually died. And even today, you really don't see that a lot because characters, superheroes, it's kind of a joke for those who read comics, will come back over and over and over again. But we get into this age of Gwen Stacy dying, so The Night That Gwen Stacy Died, and then you get into Spider-Man Blue. I believe I mentioned this in one of my collection videos. I've linked the playlist down below. But Spider-Man Blue is one of my favorite comics because Spider-Man's one of my favorite, if not my favorite hero. That being said, Spider-Man Blue and The Night That Gwen Stacy Died are fantastic looks into Spider-Man or Peter Parker's relationship with Gwen Stacy and how much that has affected him and his drive as a hero. Now, if you want to know more about Mary Jane, I mean, there are a couple works like, I don't know, there's a couple works like, oh gosh, what is it? Brand New Day or One More Day, which is one of the most controversial Spider-Man storylines where after Peter Parker and Mary Jane have been married for just a long time, I mean, in real life as well as in the Spider-Man continuity, Peter, in order to save Aunt May's life after the events of Civil War, sells his vow of marriage to Mephisto, basically annulling his marriage with Mary Jane in order to save Aunt May's life. This is considered one of the most controversial Spider-Man events and runs, if not one of the worst. I hated it. But that's one of also the best parts about comics, is just that these interesting, weird things can happen when different writers take it over. It's also one of the worst parts about comics, because these interesting, weird things can happen when other writers take over. Moving on. Yes, so there's a lot going on. Mary Jane and Gwen Stacy, just in general, are going to be featured in a lot of classic Spider-Man storylines. I mean, literally up until about the 2000s. So go ahead and read that. Gwen Stacy's going to be about until the late 70s or 80s, I think, even mid-70s, maybe 80s. I honestly forget the dating, but Mary Jane's relationship with Peter Parker even goes on to this day. Now, let's kind of go on into if you are more advanced than that, right? If you're familiar with that, all these relationships, and you want a little bit more, not even about Peter Parker maybe, or you do, but more so kind of deeper dives or later in Spider-Man's career. Let's go into his relationship with the Avengers. He's had multiple Avengers run, including, I believe, let's see, you had Brian Michael Bendis, had him on the Avengers alongside Tony Stark. I believe that was Brian Michael Bendis as well. He's written a lot for Marvel and is writing Superman for DC right now. But then you get into Jonathan Hickman's Avengers run, where Spider-Man is on the Avengers as well. These aren't critical Spider-Man works more so. The main point I was kind of leading into is that if you like Spider-Man's character, two huge works I'm going to recommend are going to be, there we go, Civil War. Civil War, which is in the mainline Marvel Comics universe, but was the basis for Captain America 3. Now, Civil War is a critical, pivotal Marvel event because it's where Tony Stark and Captain America are fighting because of the Superhero Registration Act. But Tony Stark leverages, in the comics, not the movie, Tony Stark leverages his kind of relationship with Peter Parker at the time in the comics, which takes place over the course of the Spider-Man comics at that time and the Avengers run, in order to have Peter Parker unmasked live on TV as Spider-Man. Because of this, just a flood of heroes start supporting and registering their secret identities with the government, and it's just a huge boost or bolster to Iron Man's Superhero Registration Act. However, this also puts Spider-Man's friends and loved ones in danger, so that's what leads into that One More Day event that I had mentioned earlier. But moving on, that's a great pivotal work, but it also leads into one of my favorite standalone series of Spider-Man. I believe it's by the same guy who's writing Spider-Man at the time. I think Michael Michael, I forget, Straczynski, which is Spider-Man Back in Black. So the black costume for Spider-Man is very pivotal, or not pivotal, but central to this darker Spider-Man, especially as we get into the symbiote Spider-Man and Venom, all of that good stuff. But Back in Black symbolizes his time in Spider-Man's history after Aunt May has died, and when he's just going out for blood against the people who have made this happen. Key to this is the Kingpin. And this is Spider-Man putting on the black suit, once again, the black Spider-Man suit, and going after an embarrassing, defrauding, if you will, Kingpin in the midst of jail. The Kingpin's at jail in his time and put a hit on Spider-Man, which ended up killing Aunt May. So Back in Black is another Spider-Man work that I highly recommend for those who are more familiar with the character but want to know, because this is not just your innocent Peter Parker. This is Peter Parker as an adult after he's graduated college. He's married to Mary Jane after the Civil War events. It's much more advanced and darker in narrative. Now, what about for those who are a little bit more advanced than that? Once again, this goes away from traditional mainline Peter Parker, not just Ultimate Universe even. So then there are events like Spider-Man Reign, as in Reign, like R-E-I-G-N, which I've mentioned before, which is about this. It's kind of like the Dark Knight Rises for Spider-Man. Peter Parker's an old man. He's given up being Spider-Man. Mary Jane's dead, and he has to face the Sinister Six in this kind of final showdown. But that's a work that's very controversial. I actually liked it, but I found out a lot of people, mainly through Reddit, do not like it. That's not to slam them. It's just one of those things where that's why it's really about forming your own opinions. You know, read a work, decide whether you like it or not. I liked it because of this interesting take on Spider-Man's character, as well as what it looked like in a world where he lost Mary Jane, not by his own doing, but just by natural circumstances of being Spider-Man. Now, then we go into one of my other favorite runs. Well, you've got two comics I'm also going to recommend, which are actually one comic and then one run. One is going to be Kraven's Last Hunt. Fun fact, Kraven, before Otto Octavius, Doc Ock, tried to become Spider-Man, Kraven the Hunter actually tried to become Spider-Man. So Kraven put on Spider-Man's suit. He actually, quote-unquote, killed Spider-Man and then put on the black Spider-Man suit, not just, I believe, if I'm recollecting this, not just to kill Spider-Man or Peter Parker, but to, I mean, physically, but to kill him just kind of, I guess, emotionally or mentally, right? By doing a better job at being Spider-Man in his stead and showing that people did not care about him while he was gone. So this is a dark run. I think it actually ends with, I'm not going to spoil, actually I won't spoil anything, but that's another critical Spider-Man piece, especially if you like his villains and the Sinister Six and the like, especially because Kraven's one of the characters I want to see most in the MCU or in a Spider-Man movie. I don't know, I just like this idea of a hunter who's a master tactician, a normal human who is like, peak fitness, but is able to outmaneuver Spider-Man just because of his abilities. But then we move on to the Gauntlet. So the Gauntlet, this kind of leads into the Gauntlet, I mean, years, decades later, because the Gauntlet is about Spider-Man facing his Sinister Six foes or some of his classic villains, but they're amped up. They're pretty much juiced up versions of these villains. The Lizard pretty much almost entirely separates from Kurt Connors in terms of Dr. Kurt Connors being able to dial him down or kind of restrain himself. Electro gets supercharged, learns how to use his powers better, and even has this political, like, he becomes a hero in the eyes of New York for taking down Spider-Man. Sandman goes on a bender and starts to truly unleash his power. There's just a lot going on, and all of it, you find out that it's all it's all just machined, machinated, I guess, in order to wear Spider-Man down to lead into this event called Spider-Man Grim Hunt, which is where we see Kraven the Hunter come back, but also Kraven's family come into play to try and take down Spider-Man because they are just pissed off about him killing Kraven way back in the day. Now we also go into the fact that there are two characters I wasn't even aware of it were related before before Kraven Grim Hunt, Spider-Man Grim Hunt, which is the Chameleon and Kraven are actually related. They're, I think, cousins, but it's funny to me because I had no idea about this till I read the comic. Then it's just interesting take on it. Event comics are always kind of tricky because you never know what people are going to think about it, but I enjoyed it. There's a lot of Spider-Man events. Once again, Spider-Verse is another one I mentioned. Read that if you want. It has a lot of different Spider-Men, so especially if you enjoyed Into the Spider-Verse, read Edge of the Spider-Verse, Spider-Verse, and then actually Marvel's got an event, I think it's still going on, called Spider-Geddon, which is, they had an Edge of the Spider-Geddon with other Spider-Men as well, but then they had Spider-Geddon, which is about like kind of this destruction of the universe, but focused around like Spider-Man kind of, different Spider-Man kind of focusing on saving it from their worlds from collapsing and all this. It's pretty extreme, but hey, more Spider-Man, more power to Spider-Man. Then we go, actually, I'm trying to think if I have anything more to recommend. Those are all really my main recommendations for Spider-Man is just the essentials. Oh gosh, we're going to see if I can remember all these. Just the Essential Spider-Man collections by Stan Lee, Ultimate Spider-Man with Peter Parker by Brian Michael Bendis, Ultimate Spider-Man with Miles Morales by Brian Michael Bendis and Sarah Picella. This is directly following the Ultimate Spider-Man with Peter Parker I just mentioned. And then you've got Spider-Gwen. I also forgot to mention that Gwen Stacy in that universe is getting her own tie-in or her own comic because she's called Ghost Spider in the comics now. But then you've got Spider-Gwen. I mentioned Spider-Man Blue. Let's see. I mentioned Spider-Man Blue. The night that Gwen Stacy died. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I know I've got 6 so far. I know I mentioned the Superior Spider-Man. Then I mentioned the Superior Foes of Spider-Man. Okay, come on, I can do this. Okay, then we've got, Superior Spider-Man, Superior Foes of Spider-Man. Then we've got Kraven's Last Hunt. Let's see. Yeah, Kraven's Last Hunt. Oh yeah, that's right. And then we've got Spider-Man Reign. I also mentioned that, as well as Civil War. Then I mentioned the Gauntlet. Once again, the Gauntlet is actually a run, so I'm just good. It's about, I believe, 6 volumes, so I'm going to count that because it all leads into Spider-Man Grim Hunt. And I also mentioned, I already said Spider-Man Reign, I believe, but I mentioned Spider-Man Back in Black. So I believe for the time being, I'm going to go ahead and say I think I mentioned about 14 comics. I might have mentioned more. I'm going to have to go back and double check my list. There's always more that I could recommend. Once again, these are kind of by different levels of familiarity with the character. Because I even mentioned Spider-Verse and Spider-Geddon. But all that to be said, I'm going to break it down just because, honestly, people who are typically familiar with the character will know where to go. So I'll just break it down in summary. You want to do the Essential Spider-Man collections by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, Ultimate Spider-Man with Peter Parker by Brian Michael Bendis, Ultimate Spider-Man with Miles Morales by Brian Michael Bendis, and that's around that's from 2012. That's from about 2012, not the more recent one. Then you've got Spider-Gwen by Jason Latour. Then we go into Spider-Man Blue and The Night That Gwen Stacy Died, as well as, even if you want to kind of for a stretch goal, go into Edge of the Spider-Verse and Spider-Geddon, but mainly Civil War, then Spider-Man Back in Black. People will kind of argue the best ways to go with that, but that's kind of my personal recommendation, especially those first 4 that I listed, because from there you can kind of set your own path, and you get at least familiar enough with each of those characters to go off and do your own thing. Oh, right, I mentioned Spider-Man Noir, but once again, that's a different version of Peter Parker, not the mainline continuity or ultimate continuity Peter Parker. Either way, there you go. That's in a long-winded, one-shot take, my personal recommendations on where to start with Spider-Man, as well as various Spider-Man comics I would recommend. Whew, that was a trial. But thank you all so much for tuning in. This is another edition of King's Comics. Once again, I based this video off of a recommendation or a request I saw from someone in the comments, as well as there were multiple people asking for it, which is the only reason why I'm not listing everybody. But that's what I try to do. I try to read the comments and then tailor content towards that, or otherwise I'll just be talking about the comics on my shelf or random comics that I pick up from shops. That being said, if you have any comments, feedbacks, or suggestions, drop a line down below. I do my best to check everything or drop a comment in the discussion page. I guess there's a discussion tab on this. I read those too. I would say I read those. I'm actually, I think, the only one posting on those, but I do my best to read and keep up with everything that y'all are posting. It takes a while, but I do my best. Once again, I work a full-time job outside of this, so that's why it might take me a little bit to respond to y'all. But honestly, thank you all so much for the support. If you liked what you saw today or you want to see more of it, please hit the like button. If you really liked it, please hit the subscribe button. And if you really, really liked it, please share it to a friend, a loved one, I don't know, Brian Michael Bendis or Jason Latour. Those dudes kind of killed it, as well as, I don't know, Nicolas Cage. Either way, thank you all so much for watching. I'm going to ramble on and on, so I'll just cut it short. I'm Andy King, and this has been another episode of King's Comics.